in keeping with the theme of the conference, Achieving Michigan's Transformation, I think all Michigan foundations are committed to making the state a better place in a whole variety of ways. We're also committed to using our resources as effectively and efficiently as possible. The Office of the Foundation Liaison is just one unique strategy that exists in Michigan to help us do that. The public policy affinity groups are ways to bring different foundations together around common concerns. And many of our foundations now are focused on achieving policy reform to get lasting change. So as we look at all those issues, and we look at all of the infrastructure we have in Michigan to support doing the kind of grant making that results in long-term change, it's really important that we have partners in the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector, that understand everything that foundations have to offer. And it's a lot more than just dollars. That's the piece that's missing, and that's the part we're going to address in today's session.
So first, the background. It's become an article of faith in foundation circles that philanthropy cannot do it alone, that we are not, in very important ways, an island. The problem is we often act like one, and the result is tremendous isolation from the very audiences that we seek to reach. And two audiences in particular I want to talk about. If the general public were a circle, it would be bigger than this screen. What we're looking for is a laser-like focus on two key audiences. Number one, engaged Americans. These are people who have worked in a staff capacity, a board capacity, or a committee capacity for an organization that has worked on important social or community issues over the last year. This is estimated to be 27 million people, approximately 12% of the American adult population. A fairly narrow slice. These are the folks who are really engaged in the front lines on community and social action. And then within them, at the center of the target are decision makers in government, decision makers in business, decision makers in the news media, decision makers even, and especially important, among nonprofit institutions. And we estimate those to be approximately, roughly 1 million people, 1 million adults. These are the folks that we need to reach. These are the folks that we're not reaching. And the question is, how can we bridge this gap? And if you look through the Hall of Fame in philanthropy lore, some of the great contributions of foundations, such as the Emergency 911 number, public libraries, white lines on highways, Sesame Street. These are all social innovations we take for granted today, to which foundations made major contributions, pivotal contributions, but it was only through partnership with government and business that these innovations were able to go to scale. And then there are political implications. We are vulnerable, and we are vulnerable in part because policymakers are asking more and more questions at the national and state level about what are we doing with the tax privileges we have. And in some cases, it's not even what are you doing with the tax privileges, but I want to get my hand on some of that money. That our vulnerability as a sector is going to increase exponentially, especially in light of this fiscal crisis. And this is happening, again, nationally, and it's happening locally, to the point where I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we are facing the makings of a perfect storm in philanthropy. And that's when the high-pressure front of increasing scrutiny meets the low-pressure front of continued ignorance of the value and work and impact of foundations among policymakers. Scrutiny in and of itself is not a problem. It's uninformed scrutiny that we have to worry about. And we're talking here again about this audience of engaged Americans. There are folks who are on the front lines of social and community and political action. We would assume they're PTA presidents and chambers of commerce heads and state legislators. And we would assume that they know a lot about foundations. That's what we assumed going in. We were wrong. 6 out of 10 of them cannot name a foundation on the first try. Low awareness of foundations to begin with. Only 11% of engaged Americans can identify an example of foundation impact on an issue they care about. Only 15% can identify an example of a foundation's impact on their own community. But there's good news. Very high favorability and goodwill towards foundations. Very high. 86% think foundations are important to society. Foundations have favorability ratings that any politician would envy. And the more experienced engaged Americans are with foundations, the more involvement they have, the higher their favorability ratings. We have 3 ambassadors, potential ambassadors who are missing from the field. Number 1 is grantees, and Ralph Smith in a recent conversation was talking about how grantees are incredibly disaffected and in some cases are fighting against us, not on our behalf. But they are some of the best potential ambassadors that we have in terms of talking about the value and impact of foundations. Executives, we found over the last several years of doing the Philanthropy Awareness Initiative that executives don't care very much or don't have a high level of urgency about this issue. And then foundation trustees. And this is the critical audience, and Philanthropy 3D, the project, the Michigan project, and PAI pilot that Vicki's going to talk about is targeting trustees. And if you think about two Venn diagram of 2 intersecting circles, and one circle are philanthropy leaders, and in the other circle are influentials in other sectors. In that intersection are foundation trustees, some of the best ambassadors that we have, and underutilized. And then finally, we've identified 3, probably a range, and by we I mean foundation leaders and Philanthropy Association leaders that we've talked to have identified 3 big challenges in foundation practice. A real lack of clarity and even a sense of ownership about the impact that foundations have, highly reactive in relationship building, highly reactive, and a lack of consensus within the philanthropy sector about the role of foundations, about what is the social contract of philanthropy in American society.
And so our goal, which we actually changed last week for this initiative as we moved forward and learned more, is to increase the capacity of Michigan's philanthropic sector, that's all of you plus us, to define and promote your transformational value to influential leaders in our state. And our targets in terms of influential leaders are that middle group primarily, from the public, private, nonprofit sectors, and higher ed, because in this state, higher ed matters a lot. We also realized that nobody out there in our target audience actually cared about how great foundations are. It was like, that's a big snore. Okay. So we thought, well, what would make them listen to us? And we realized that the only thing that really matters to them is Michigan. That's what we all hold in common, and right now we're all concerned about the state's economic situation. The next piece was, who's going to help us figure out how to tell that story? We decided it was foundation trustees, because they have a reach and a social network that is to the most influential people in our state and in our federal government, and we don't ask them to tell the story. We want to know, when you go to a cocktail party, are you talking about the foundation you are a trustee of? What do you talk about when somebody asks you? That's ultimately our goal, to seed that conversation by creating new messages based on interviews we do with foundation trustees and the influentials they point us to, finding out what they really think now, and then working with members like Marilyn and other communications directors and some of our public policy committee leaders and saying, okay, then this is the message we want to tell. CMF will tell them it's in its packaging. We want individual members to use those same messages, and through this kind of multiplier effect, over time people will start talking about the field differently because they're reading about that all the time, not about such and such a foundation gave $3 million to a nonprofit, but here's what's happening in Michigan around protecting our environment and natural resources. Here's what's happening to give children, young children, an opportunity to succeed in life.
And let me reinforce one thing that Vicki said. In our national work at the Philanthropy Awareness Initiative and working and doing research on these issues around the country, we found that it's not enough for associations to do the work. What we've discovered is even when you have incredible regional associations like CMF, it's not enough that they alone do the work. We need your participation. We need individual foundation executives and leaders to be talking about the impact of philanthropy collectively, to be building relationships for influence and impact on a collective scale. And we haven't done that as well as we should in philanthropy.